is maybe special about Victory Day in the Soviet tradition is that there's a unique combination of mourning and celebration. Because on the one hand, it's a day to commemorate a war in which 27 million people died on the Soviet side. On the other hand, from the very beginning, it was a day to celebrate victory rather than the victims and the destruction of war. So from the beginning, there was a very strong, joyous and celebratory note. But on the other hand, people are, of course, mindful of all the lives lost. And this is also something that has never quite disappeared from the celebrations. And I guess this particular combination of an awareness of the magnitude of suffering and death with very strong, often nationalistic pride in the achievement of victory, that I guess is what makes it maybe not entirely unique, but quite special compared to what we know from other countries or other geographical contexts. When people have looked back at the history of Victory Day, starting in 1945, usually they have talked about it in terms of the state with its own ideological agenda versus the people with their authentic memories. And I think that's a little simplistic. So on the one hand, of course, when the Soviet Union won the war, it was a totalitarian dictatorship that placed a very strong premium on ideology and propaganda. So there was a very clear idea on the part of the state and the party agencies that all commemoration and all celebration of victory has to serve the objectives of socialist propaganda. There was never a question about that. From the very beginning, all the big commemorative events were carefully planned. They were always discussed in advance by various propaganda and ideological agencies. There was always the idea under late Stalinism, but also in the late Soviet Union, that the state has to provide a very clear structure that would channel the celebration of Victory Day and other military commemorative holidays into the objectives of patriotism, mobilization, the patriotic education of youth. And actually, in the first years in particular, maybe in the first 2 decades or so after the end of the Second World War, the main purpose from the point of view of the state and of the army of these days was to educate young people in a spirit of patriotic self-sacrifice so that they would become good soldiers. But I doubt that the other pole of this commemorative spectrum was ever really something like, completely free and authentic memory. Because what we know from many decades of the scholarly study of memory is that there's no such thing as a completely authentic memory. Memory always works through social frames, right? And we always need to consider what kinds of social frames were available to people who wanted to commemorate the war one way or the other, right? And there weren't that many options for them at the time, right? So there were a lot of different frames that all somehow were tied to the state. So apart from that, there weren't that many options. And I guess one of the main options was religion. And we know, especially from research done by historians of religion in rural areas of the Soviet Union, that religious commemoration was extremely active and extremely important throughout the post-war years and well into the 1960s, or maybe even later. So people would engage in religious rituals, Christian, Jewish in particular. They would go to churches. They would engage in all sorts of kind of folk ritual practices tied to commemorating the dead. So that, I guess, was one of the main alternatives, and the state then, especially starting in the late 50s, sought very actively to counteract this religious tradition by replacing it with new Soviet rituals that were sometimes similar in form, to these old religious traditions, but kind of tried to infuse them with new socialist or atheist content. The state kept offering certain frameworks, and then people sometimes would resist them, but at other times they would actually take them up, but then creatively change them in a sense from below, right? So the state would say, well, you need to take care of communal graves of the soldiers who died liberating your village or your town or your region. And there were several decrees throughout the 1940s, 50s, and 60s mandating that. And then, sometimes people would respond very formally, saying, well, of course, let's put an obelisk there and forget about it. But sometimes they would use that opportunity to maybe create some original monument of their own, or come up with some new original ritual of their own, right? For example, some sort of procession where they would carry a symbolic object that was important to their locality, or maybe they would adapt an interesting tradition from their place that previously was not limited to war commemoration, but they would kind of turn it into something linked to war commemoration. So to give you just one example from Ukraine, there's a tradition in Ukraine of creating monuments inside cemeteries that are made of stone, typically, but they look like tree trunks with the branches cut off, symbolizing death and passage to the next world. And there is at least one really interesting example of people working in a quarry in the Zhytomyr region of Ukraine, who very soon after the war created a monument just like that from the granite that they had available in the quarry, but then they put a tank on top. So, nobody from Moscow or Kyiv mandated this. There was a general idea that people needed to put up monuments, and then they kind of, creatively adapted that. And there are many, many examples of that. So I would picture this process all the way from, actually the end of the war, before the war had really ended, all the way until today, as a kind of a dialectic where, the state proposes something, people then creatively adapt that, and some of these adaptations then make it into the state's repertoire and are spread in a more kind of homogeneous fashion all over the territory. But in the process, the state's repertoire also changes. And that's what makes this dialectic so interesting. So I'm not trying to suggest that what we are dealing with here are kind of subversive resistance practices from below that completely divert what the state wanted to do with commemoration. But there are interesting changes, right? And so I think 1965 is a very interesting moment where both the state leadership and a lot of people who had actually fought in the war had very kind of matching interests, right? The state leadership was interested in, first of all, a new basis for legitimacy, but also in diffusing social tensions by giving the people a new holiday, or actually several new holidays, because March 8th, which is International Women's Day, was also introduced as a work-free holiday at the same time. But then at the same time, people who were part of the veterans generation, who had now grown older and reached, many of them, influential social positions, they were also very interested in having themselves celebrated by the younger generation. So these interests coincided, and in the process, things that had originally been developed on the western periphery of the Soviet Union, in the regions that had been under occupation or that had seen the front, had seen actual fighting, these practices then spread to the furthest corners of the Soviet Union. So that things that in the 50s and early 60s you would typically encounter only in the western parts of the country, then all of a sudden you would get in places like Ulan-Ude or, I don't know, Irkutsk, or places that had been very, very far removed from the European front, right? But then what happens in the post-Soviet period is kind of another cycle of this dialectic, because the people who now come to the fore are the grandchildren's generation. And very often what motivates them is a sense of a lost connection with their grandparents. Very often between parents and children, there's there's a problem in communication, because the events that could be commemorated are still too fresh in memory. So especially if people feel traumatized by these events, they will often prefer to keep silence and not talk to their children. And the children in turn often feel oppressed by too much narrative, too much memory. And by the time the grandchildren come along, these tensions have kind of subsided a little bit. And the mnemonic connection between grandparents and grandchildren often is much closer. So what we're seeing now is that very often it's the grandchildren's generation. So people who have no direct experiential link to the Second World War. They don't have any memories of their own. This is what has been called post-memory. But they're trying to, recreate an authentic memory of their own. And in so doing, they're coming up with all sorts of new practices. And all the major practices that we have seen emerge in connection with the commemoration of the Second World War in post-Soviet space, they are part of this dynamic. So the St. George's ribbon, which was invented in 2005, which is this black and orange ribbon that people wear to show their connection with war memory, and then also increasingly their patriotism and their connection with Russia. Or the Immortal Regiment, which I think is the most important example. This procession that started in 2012, where people march through typically the center of a city with portraits of mostly their grandparents who fought in the war or who had some connection to the war. The state has been investing considerable resources into Victory Day celebrations and the whole vast commemorative culture that has grown up around it. And this is not something that started under Putin. It started with Yeltsin really in 1995, but it has reached a whole new level under Putin. But of course, this only works because there is demand for it, right? It's not just a top-down project that was entirely invented from scratch by the state and then people just swallowed it. It's something that only works because a sufficient number of people are interested in this for their own reasons. The role of the Russian state, I would say, in all of these contexts, both in Russia but also abroad, is one of maybe a catalyst. So what typically happens is that there's a community of people in a country that for whatever reason is interested in keeping this style of commemoration alive, right? And in countries like Estonia or Latvia, it might be because these are Russian speakers who are feeling maybe marginalized in their own understanding of history. In a country like Israel, it might be because people of Russian or Soviet origin might feel that they or their parents aren't really being considered fully part of Israeli society. So for whatever reason, they're interested in giving more publicity to this kind of commemoration. And then, if the state that they live in is not interested in this or is even opposed to this kind of commemoration, then some of them will be very grateful for the resources that the Russian state provides. And this will always come with an expectation that whoever commemorates the victory of the Red Army in some way is in line, in agreement with the politics of history proposed by the Russian state today. The first places of commemoration were typically grave sites and monuments erected atop graves. So we're talking about the western parts of the Soviet Union that had been under German occupation, that were then liberated by the Red Army, and about places in Central and Eastern Europe that also saw some fighting. Most of these places were rural. So most of the graves were in rural areas, And most of the first monuments were outside of the big cities, right? Which is why initially after the war, people in the big cities inside the Soviet Union had kind of less of a direct connection with these kinds of commemorative practices, because of course there were far fewer reminders, physical reminders of actual fighting in places like Moscow or even Leningrad, although that's a separate story with the blockade, than in all of Ukraine, for example. And Ukraine, of course, mostly was a rural country. So in the first, certainly 20 years, the vast majority of these places were in rural areas. So, in a sense, if you wanted to engage in commemoration, you actually had to go there. But then, in the 1960s and 70s, what happened is that war memory, along with most of the Soviet population, became urbanized, right? So the 60s are the moment in Soviet history when, for the first time, more than half of the population lives in cities, in urban areas. And what happens then is that instead of having a gravesite with, bones, with dead people, with dead bodies, and a monument commemorating that, you have a new district with new streets and squares and new spaces that, for example, are named after war heroes. And then commemoration begins to take place in these new spaces. And that, of course, is very, very different from this much more direct connection with dead bodies that you had in the earlier times. So now, what starts developing is this much more joyous style of commemoration, where it's much more about gratitude for the blue skies above our heads and for our peaceful existence, and you interact with surviving veterans, but you're no longer really so exposed to material reminders of death. And the monuments that are now built in the 60s, and of course the 60s and 70s and 80s were a time when monuments were being built all over the Soviet Union, most of these monuments are no longer connected to actual burial sites. Some are, and there's a lot of reburying taking place. But since monuments now appear in places like the Urals or Kyrgyzstan, right, where maybe you had some soldiers who died in hospitals, but there was no dying on the same scale as in Belarus, for example, right? So now this war memory becomes kind of more indirect, more mediated, and it's much more attached to symbols. If we look at Soviet war memorials, aesthetically, actually, they are not as unique as people sometimes make them out to be. The monuments that Soviet sculptors and architects started to build were not that different from what people in other European countries had been building, since the First World War or even before that. Because of course these sculptors and architects had, some of them studied in West European countries, and they were very much aware of this tradition, and there was this idea that war memorials have to have a classical look about them, etc. So I think the reason why nowadays often people perceive them as somehow anachronistic is because of this time gap, and because in many Western countries, memorialization culture after the Second World War moved in a somewhat different direction, with much more abstraction, less monumental styles, more focus on victims rather than heroes, etc. But I don't think that's really what's most interesting about the memorials. What I think is, or one of the things that I find most interesting, is that there are so many of them, right? I mean, partly because so many people died. And initially, at least, the vast majority of Soviet war memorials, all the ones built during the war itself and in the 20 years after it, were actually memorials that were also grave markers, right? They were built atop graves, usually communal graves. And because there were so many of these graves in so many different places, there are so many memorials, right? Not just in the former Soviet Union itself, but also in all the countries where the Red Army fought, not just the former satellite states, but also Norway, Italy even for Soviet partisans, and many other countries, North Korea, China. So wherever Red Army soldiers actually fought in the Second World War, you find these memorials. From the very beginning of war commemoration in the Soviet Union, the international or transnational aspect was always very important. For example, the Soviet Veterans Union was only created because there was an international federation that was being set up at that time in the mid-50s. And the Soviet authorities realized that they need some sort of body of their own. When you read Soviet newspapers from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, not just the central ones, but also I've been reading a lot of regional newspapers all the way from Grodno to Vladivostok. Every time there's a commemorative celebration, especially Victory Day, they were always full of reports about how these days are being celebrated abroad, in Prague, in Paris, in Helsinki, in Beijing. So this was always a very important part. And then very often the connection was made with celebrations inside the Soviet Union. And then even in 1965, when Victory Day once again became a work-free holiday, there was at the very least a kind of international factor in that decision, because this was a moment when in West Germany there was a big debate about the statute of limitations for Nazi crimes. So 20 years after the end of the war, according to the legislation in force at the time, West Germany was supposed to stop pursuing Nazi criminals. And the West German government at the time was kind of happy to let that happen. And then there was a huge outcry all over the world, the United States, Israel, West European countries, but also, of course, the GDR, Poland, and the Soviet Union. And I know from my archival research that this is a topic that was very actively discussed in the Politburo, in the Secretariat of the Central Committee in 1964 and 1965. And that was actually the first occasion when people started talking about maybe turning Victory Day in Moscow into this kind of big showcase for the world, right? Having a big parade, inviting lots of representatives from other countries. So the kind of revitalization of war commemoration in the Soviet Union was, at least in part, due to the importance of the topic on the international arena. So, of course, it's always impossible to predict the future, but in the history of Victory Day, we've seen that the ways in which it has been celebrated have changed dramatically. So there's no reason to suppose that now we have reached the stage at which nothing will change anymore. And the way in which I like to think about the possible future of Victory Day or scenarios for Victory Day have to do with the history of other commemorative dates. Once the grandchildren's generation, which is so central to war commemoration in the post-Soviet world today, is gone, I think we will see some serious changes, and I do think that this whole culture of war commemoration will become less important and less central to public culture. So probably, it will not disappear entirely. I'm pretty sure that it will remain something that most people are aware of. But I think increasingly in the future, it will be something that is borne by specialists rather than, the population as a whole, even in a country like Russia or Belarus. Then it would become maybe relatively similar to civil war commemoration in the United States, right? So, the Civil War was an extremely bloody conflict, one of the bloodiest in world history in the 19th century. And it's still something that's extremely important to a lot of people in the United States. Even the children and grandchildren of more recent immigrants. But it's not something that's part of everyday life, the way that Victory Day or that war commemoration still is part of everyday life in some post-Soviet countries. So I think it might evolve into that kind of direction. So that's one scenario. Another scenario that I'm seeing, especially outside of Russia, is that Victory Day already is becoming something of a kind of ethnic Russian cultural holiday. It's becoming just an occasion for Russian speakers or people who feel some sort of affinity with Russian culture to get together and, celebrate their pride in that culture. But then, the other extreme that is at least conceivable as a scenario of development would be a kind of, almost sudden disappearance. And I think if we look back at the history of war commemoration, there are a few examples of things like that happening, but it usually happens only if there's a new, even bigger cataclysm that sort of obliterates previous memory. And the example that I like to cite of this is Sedan Day in Imperial Germany, which was the biggest commemorative holiday between 1871 and the First World War. But then the First World War came along, which was, of course, a much bloodier conflict and much more momentous in a sense. And then after that, in the Weimar Republic, the commemoration of Sedan Day, it didn't disappear entirely, but it became extremely marginal, almost overnight. So I think that, just as a thought experiment for something that is so widespread and so important and so, deeply felt by a lot of people as post-Soviet war commemoration, for something like that to disappear, something else has to come along and kind of, completely distract people and turn their kind of mnemonic attention in a new direction. And all I can say is I really hope that nothing like this will happen, because I'm sure that it would be a catastrophe of terrible proportions. And I'd much rather see a gradual evolution of the kind of war commemoration that we have right now, with all its messiness, with all its problems, with all its potential for conflict, than something that would suddenly wipe it all out and create a completely new memory.